Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know how we love to really dig deep into some fascinating reads?
Oh, yeah.
And today we're diving headfirst into one that really gets the gears turning.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, it is. We're talking about the book Myth and Mayhem, which is a collection of essays that take a critical look at the work of Jordan Peterson.
I'm really excited to get into this.
Me too. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Peterson. He's that Canadian psychologist who's become quite a cultural figure in recent years. You know, he's sparked all sorts of conversations.
Definitely polarizing figure for sure, and that's what makes this book so interesting.
Exactly. It brings together a diverse group of authors, each with their own expertise, to examine Peterson's ideas from different angles.
Right. And it's not just a takedown of Peterson or anything. The book acknowledges that his work has resonated with a lot of people and that he's offered some valuable insights. But it also raises some important questions and concerns about the implications of some of his views, especially when it comes to social and political issues.
Yeah, that's what I found so compelling about it. So where do we even begin with a figure as complex and multifaceted as Jordan Peterson?
Well, Myth and Mayhem starts by tackling one of his most well-known and perhaps controversial arguments, the idea that we can learn about the necessity of hierarchies in human society from lobsters.
Lobsters, okay, I have to admit that one caught me off guard too.
Yeah, it sounds a bit strange at first, but Peterson's argument goes something like this. Just like lobsters, humans are wired for dominance hierarchies.
Oh.
He points to the fact that lobsters who win fights have higher levels of serotonin, which is a neurochemical associated with feelings of well-being and confidence.
So he's drawing a parallel between the behavior of lobsters and the way human societies are structured.
Right, and he suggests that this same drive for status and dominance plays out in human societies, leading to things like income inequality and the concentration of wealth and power.
So essentially he's saying that inequality is just a natural part of life, something we've inherited from our crustacean ancestors.
That's one way to interpret it. And it's an argument that has resonated with some because it seems to offer a scientific justification for the way things are. But Myth and Mayhem pushes back against this idea pretty strongly.
In what way?
Well, the authors point out that human societies are far more complex than lobster colonies. Our behaviors are shaped by a whole host of factors, culture, history, and social structures. To reduce human behavior down to simple biological drives is overly simplistic, to say the least.
Yeah, it's like saying, hey, ants have queens, so humans should have monarchs. Doesn't quite hold up, does it?
Exactly. The book argues that Peterson's making a classic logical fallacy, equating what is in nature with what ought to be in human society. Just because something exists in the animal kingdom doesn't mean it's morally justifiable or socially desirable for us.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how Peterson's argument could be appealing to some. It seems to offer a kind of order and certainty in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another important point, that Myth and Mayhem raises the potential dangers of what they call naturalizing inequality.
Okay, what do they mean by that?
If we accept the idea that hierarchies are simply natural and inevitable, it becomes much easier to dismiss the very real problems of injustice and systemic oppression. It's like saying, well, that's just the way the world works. Nothing we can do about it.
And that kind of thinking can lead to complacency and a reluctance to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. Myth and Mayhem encourages us to be critical of any argument that uses biology to justify social inequalities. We need to remember that humans have the capacity for reason, empathy, and moral judgment. We're not just lobsters acting out our biological programming. We have the power to create a more just and equitable world, but only if we refuse to accept the idea that inequality is simply natural.
I think that's a really crucial point. So we tackle the lobsters. What other thought-provoking critiques does Myth and Mayhem offer?
Well, another essay delves into a piece of advice that Peterson is quite famous for. Clean your room before you criticize the world. It's catchy, and on the surface, it sounds like pretty solid advice.
I mean, yeah, there's definitely something to be said for taking responsibility for your own life and trying to improve yourself.
Right. But Myth and Mayhem digs a little deeper into the implications of this rule, suggesting that it could be used to stifle social critique and activism.
How so?
Well, imagine someone is struggling with poverty, facing discrimination, or living in a community devastated by pollution. If they try to speak out about these issues, someone could easily use Peterson's advice to shut them down. Well, have you even cleaned your own room? You need to get your own life in order before you try to fix the world.
Yeah, that's pretty dismissive. It's like telling someone to ignore a burning building because their shoelaces are untied.
Exactly. The book argues that while personal responsibility is important, it shouldn't be used as a way to silence those who are trying to address systemic problems. Focusing solely on individual actions can distract from the need for collective action and social change. It's like blaming the victims of a flood for not building their houses on higher ground, rather than addressing the underlying issues of climate change and inadequate infrastructure.
It seems like it's about striking a balance between personal responsibility and recognizing the need for broader social change.
Yes, and Myth and Mayhem encourages us to be mindful of the potential pitfalls of taking Peterson's clean your room advice too literally, or using it as a way to shut down important conversations about social justice.
This makes me curious about Peterson's broader political philosophy. I know he's often associated with conservative viewpoints. Does Myth and Mayhem touch on that at all?
It does. The book explores how Peterson's emphasis on individual responsibility aligns with his skepticism of collective action and government intervention. It suggests that his clean your room philosophy can be seen as an extension of this broader worldview, one that prioritizes self-reliance and traditional values over social welfare programs or systemic reforms.
So he's essentially saying that if everyone just focused on improving themselves, we wouldn't need things like social safety nets or government regulations.
Ooh, that's one way to interpret his stance. And Myth and Mayhem encourages us to consider the potential consequences of this viewpoint. What happens to those who, for whatever reason, are unable to clean their room? What about the systemic issues that create and perpetuate poverty, discrimination, and environmental degradation? Can individual action alone truly address these problems?
Those are some pretty heavy questions.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like Myth and Mayhem is really challenging us to think critically about Peterson's ideas and to consider the potential downsides of his approach.
Absolutely. And it doesn't shy away from tackling some of his most controversial statements, including his views on what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism.
Ah, yes, I've heard him talk about that. It sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, to be honest.
Well, Myth and Mayhem digs into the origins of this term and how Peterson uses it to create a sort of intellectual boogeyman. He suggests that there's this shadowy cabal of academics and activists who are trying to undermine Western civilization by promoting radical ideas about gender identity and social justice.
And he ties this all back to Marxism.
Yes, he argues that postmodernism is essentially a rebranded form of Marxism, a way of disguising a radical agenda under the guise of intellectual sophistication.
But isn't postmodernism just a philosophical movement that questions grand narratives and emphasizes the importance of multiple perspectives? How does that connect to Marxism, which is a socioeconomic theory about class struggle and the means of production?
That's one of the key points that Myth and Mayhem raises. The book argues that Peterson is conflating two very different concepts and using them to create a simplistic and misleading narrative. It's like saying that environmentalism is just a rebranded form of socialism because both ideologies critique corporate greed.
So he's basically creating a straw man argument to dismiss anyone who challenges his worldview.
That's one way to interpret it. And Myth and Mayhem encourages us to be wary of this kind of rhetorical tactic. It's easy to demonize an opponent by misrepresenting their arguments and lumping them into a broad, scary-sounding category.
It's classic us versus them kind of thinking.
Exactly. And Myth and Mayhem urges us to resist this kind of simplistic thinking. It encourages us to engage with complex ideas in a nuanced and critical way, even if those ideas make us uncomfortable or challenge our existing beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. When you really look at it, Peterson tends to use these broad strokes to paint a picture of an intellectual enemy.
Right. It's like he's creating this whole category of postmodern neo-Marxists as a kind of catch-all term for anyone he disagrees with.
Exactly. But when you actually dig into the specifics of postmodernism and Marxism, it becomes clear that his portrayal is pretty distorted.
So how does Myth and Mayhem address this distortion? What are some of the key arguments they make against Peterson's take on postmodernism and Marxism?
One of the first things the book points out is that postmodernism isn't a monolithic ideology. It's a broad intellectual movement with a wide range of thinkers and perspectives.
Right. It's not like there's this single unified group of postmodernists all marching in lockstep with the same agenda.
Exactly. Some postmodern thinkers, like Michel Foucault, were definitely critical of power structures and social institutions. But others, like Jacques Derrida, were more focused on deconstructing language and meaning. To lump them all together as part of some nefarious postmodern neo-Marxist agenda is just inaccurate.
It's like saying that all biologists are environmental activists just because they study the natural world. There's a huge diversity of thought and focus within any intellectual field.
Precisely. And the book also points out that Peterson often misrepresents the arguments of postmodern thinkers, taking their ideas out of context or twisting them to fit his narrative. For example, he claims that postmodernism denies the existence of objective truth.
Yeah, I've heard him say that, but that seems like a pretty extreme interpretation of postmodern thought.
It is. That's a gross oversimplification. Many postmodern thinkers simply argue that our understanding of truth is always shaped by our perspectives and experiences. They don't deny the existence of reality itself, but they recognize the limitations of our human perception.
So it's more about acknowledging the complexity of knowledge and interpretation rather than rejecting the idea of truth altogether.
Exactly. And Myth and Mayhem argues that this is actually a valuable insight. Recognizing the limitations of our own perspectives can make us more open to dialogue, understanding, and critical thinking. It's about acknowledging that there are multiple ways of seeing the world and that no one person or group has a monopoly on truth.
But Peterson seems to see this as a threat. He frames it as an attack on reason and objectivity, a slippery slope toward moral relativism and chaos.
Right, and that's where his conflation of postmodernism with Marxism comes into play. He argues that postmodernism is essentially a tool for undermining traditional values and dismantling the foundations of Western civilization. He sees it as a way of justifying radical social change and dismantling hierarchies of power.
Okay, but how does he connect that to Marxism? Isn't Marxism primarily concerned with economics and class struggle?
Yes. But Peterson argues that postmodernism has adopted the Marxist framework and simply applied it to different areas of life, like gender, race, and sexuality. He suggests that instead of focusing on class conflict, postmodern neo-Marxists are now obsessed with identity politics and dividing society along the lines of race, gender, and sexual orientation.
So he's basically saying that any attempt to address social inequalities is just a disguised form of Marxism.
That's the essence of his argument. And it's a very effective rhetorical strategy because it taps into a lot of anxieties and fears that people have about social change. It suggests that any challenge to the status quo is part of a sinister plot to destroy Western civilization.
It's like a classic boogeyman tactic, create a scary enemy to rally people against.
Exactly. And Myth and Mayhem encourages us to be very critical of this kind of rhetoric. It's important to remember that Peterson is offering a very specific interpretation of history and social change, one that is heavily influenced by his own ideological commitments.
So how should we approach these complex issues if we're not supposed to just accept Peterson's framing?
Well, Myth and Mayhem encourages us to engage with these ideas directly, to read the works of postmodern and Marxist thinkers for ourselves, and to form our own opinions based on a nuanced understanding of the arguments. It's about recognizing that these are complex issues with no easy answers, and that simplistic narratives often obscure more than they reveal.
This brings up another interesting point, that the book raises the idea of the Hitchens effect. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to Jordan Peterson?
The Hitchens effect refers to the phenomenon of a speaker or writer being so charismatic and persuasive that they can convince people of their arguments, even if those arguments are flawed or lacking in evidence.
Oh, I see. So it's like the power of personality and presentation can sometimes overshadow the actual substance of what's being said.
Right. It's named after Christopher Hitchens, who was a brilliant writer and debater known for his sharp wit and ability to sway audiences even when his positions were controversial or factually questionable.
I can definitely see how that applies to Peterson. He has a very captivating presence and a way of speaking that conveys absolute certainty.
And Myth and Mayhem argues that this can be dangerous. It's easy to be swept away by Peterson's charisma and eloquence, to accept his pronouncements as gospel truth without scrutinizing them carefully.
So we need to be extra vigilant when listening to someone like Peterson, even if we find ourselves drawn to his style and message.
Exactly. It's important to separate the messenger from the message, to evaluate the arguments on their own merits, regardless of how compelling the speaker might be.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But Peterson isn't just a charismatic speaker. He's also a prolific writer, especially with his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life. Does Myth and Mayhem engage with his written work as well?
It does. In fact, there's an entire essay devoted to analyzing Peterson's writing style and how it contributes to his persuasive power.
Oh, interesting. What are some of the insights from that essay?
The author of that essay argues that Peterson uses a number of rhetorical techniques to create a sense of authority and to make his arguments seem more compelling than they actually are.
Can you give us some examples of these techniques?
Sure. One technique Peterson frequently uses is what the book calls grand pronouncements. These are sweeping statements that sound profound and insightful, but are often vague or lacking in concrete evidence. For example, he might say something like, "The West is in decline because it has lost its spiritual foundation."
It sounds very dramatic and attention-grabbing.
Yeah.
But when you break it down, it's not really saying much of substance.
Exactly. It's a way of creating a sense of urgency and importance without actually providing any substance to back it up.
So it's more about generating an emotional response than engaging in rigorous analysis.
Right. And this ties into another technique that Peterson uses, frequently appealing to tradition and authority. He often frames his arguments in terms of timeless wisdom, evoking ancient myths, religious texts, and historical figures to lend weight to his claims.
I've noticed that he often quotes the Bible and other religious texts, even though he doesn't explicitly identify as a religious believer.
Yes, and that's a clever rhetorical strategy. By invoking these sources of authority, he creates a sense of gravitas and makes it seem like his arguments are grounded in something larger and more profound than his own personal opinions.
So it's a way of bypassing the need for empirical evidence or logical reasoning.
In a sense, yes. It's about creating an aura of wisdom and authority, even if the arguments themselves don't hold up under scrutiny.
It sounds like Myth and Mayhem is encouraging us to be really careful readers of Peterson's work, to pay attention to not just what he says, but how he says it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that rhetoric is a powerful tool, and it can be used to manipulate as well as to inform.
This makes me think about one of Peterson's most infamous statements. His claim that enforced monogamy could be a solution to the problem of violence against women. That one really sparked a lot of controversy.
Yes, that was a very provocative statement, and it's a good example of how Peterson's rhetorical style can obscure the underlying logic of his arguments. Myth and Mayhem dedicates an entire essay to unpacking this controversy, exploring the various interpretations of Peterson's claim and the implications of his suggestion.
So what's the gist of the book's analysis? What do they make of Peterson's enforced monogamy argument?
Well, the book starts by acknowledging that Peterson has tried to clarify his position, claiming that he wasn't advocating for forced marriages or government-mandated relationships. Instead, he argues that he was simply pointing out that traditional social norms that encourage monogamy can help to reduce violence against women.
So he's basically saying that if everyone just got married and stayed married, there would be less violence.
That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it captures the essence of his argument, and Myth and Mayhem pushes back on this idea pretty hard. The authors point out that there's no clear evidence to support the claim that monogamy inherently reduces violence against women. In fact, many studies have shown that domestic violence is just as prevalent, if not more so, within monogamous relationships.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Violence against women is a complex issue with roots in patriarchy, power imbalances, and toxic masculinity. It's not simply a matter of relationship status.
Exactly. And Myth and Mayhem argues that Peterson's focus on enforced monogamy as a solution is a distraction from these more fundamental issues. It's a way of placing the blame on women for not conforming to traditional gender roles, rather than addressing the underlying causes of violence and inequality.
It's a bit like saying that if women just dressed more modestly, they wouldn't be harassed or assaulted. It shifts the responsibility away from the perpetrators and places it on the victims.
Exactly. And Myth and Mayhem calls out this kind of victim-blaming rhetoric, pointing out the dangers of framing violence against women as a problem that can be solved by simply enforcing traditional social norms.
So it's not just about the specific content of Peterson's argument, but also about the broader implications of his framing.
Yes, and that's one of the key takeaways from Myth and Mayhem. It's not enough to simply fact-check Peterson's claims or to debunk his specific arguments. We need to be aware of the underlying assumptions, the rhetorical strategies, and the potential consequences of his approach.
It's about developing a critical lens through which to view his work and to evaluate its impact on society.
Precisely. And that's what makes this book so valuable. It's not just a critique of Jordan Peterson, but a guide to navigating the complexities of intellectual discourse in a world where charismatic figures often hold immense sway. It's interesting how Myth and Mayhem digs into not just what Peterson says, but also why his message seems to resonate with so many people.
Yeah, we've been talking about some potentially problematic aspects of his rhetoric, but there's no denying that he's struck a chord with a large audience. What does the book have to say about the factors that contribute to his popularity?
Well, it suggests that Peterson's appeal is partly due to his ability to speak to a sense of anxiety and uncertainty that a lot of people feel in the world today. You know, things are changing rapidly and it can be hard to make sense of it all.
Right. There's this feeling of things being in flux, of traditional values and structures being challenged.
Exactly. And Peterson steps in and offers a sense of order and meaning amidst all that chaos.
So he's kind of like a guide, offering a roadmap for navigating a world that feels increasingly complex and unpredictable.
That's a good way to put it. He offers simple answers to complex questions, a sense of structure and purpose in a world that often feels lacking in clear direction. His emphasis on personal responsibility, self-improvement, and traditional values really resonates with folks who are yearning for a return to a perceived simpler time.
I can especially see that resonating with young men who are often bombarded with all these conflicting messages about masculinity and their place in society.
Absolutely. Peterson comes in with a very clear and assertive message. Stand up straight, take responsibility for your life, embrace those traditional masculine virtues.
But I think it's important to remember that Myth and Mayhem cautions us against accepting these messages uncritically right. It encourages us to examine the potential downsides of Peterson's approach.
Definitely. While his emphasis on personal responsibility can be empowering, it can also slip into a kind of victim blaming that ignores the systemic factors that contribute to inequality and suffering. That focus on individual action could distract from the need for collective efforts to address social problems.
It's kind of like telling someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't even have boots.
That's a great analogy. The book really urges us to think about the broader context, to understand that individual choices are always shaped by social structures and systemic forces. It's not always as simple as just taking responsibility.
Right. And this brings us back to that idea of naturalizing inequality that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Peterson seems to suggest that hierarchies and power imbalances are just an inevitable part of life. But Myth and Mayhem pushes back against that assumption.
Absolutely. The book argues that while there might be biological underpinnings to certain human behaviors, our social structures aren't predetermined. We actually have the capacity to create a more just and equitable world. But only if we recognize that inequality isn't some natural law. It's actually a product of human choices and the systems we create.
So it's kind of a call to action to challenge the status quo and work towards a more just society.
Definitely. And it's a reminder that Peterson's worldview, while appealing to some, is just one perspective among many. Myth and Mayhem encourages us to engage with different viewpoints, to think critically, and to come to our own conclusions based on a nuanced understanding of the issues.
This has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like Myth and Mayhem is a must-read for anyone who wants to engage with Peterson's ideas in a thoughtful and critical way. It provides a really valuable counterpoint to his often polarizing rhetoric.
Couldn't agree more. It's not about dismissing Peterson entirely. It's about understanding the complexities of his arguments, the allure of his message, and the potential pitfalls of his approach.
It's about developing a critical lens and using it to navigate the often choppy waters of intellectual discourse, especially in today's world.
And to remember that simple answers rarely do justice to the nuances of complex social and political problems.
So true. Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive into the world of Jordan Peterson and the critiques presented in Myth and Mayhem. It's given me a lot to think about.
One final thought that keeps coming back to me is the importance of intellectual humility. We should always be willing to question our own assumptions, to truly listen to and engage with people who hold different views, and to recognize that we don't always have all the answers.
That's such a crucial point, especially nowadays when it's so easy to get trapped in our own echo chambers and just shut down anyone who disagrees with us.
We need to foster a spirit of curiosity, open-mindedness, and a willingness to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we encounter ideas that challenge our own deeply held beliefs. That's how we grow and learn.
And that's exactly what Myth and Mayhem encourages us to do. It's a call for thoughtful, critical, and nuanced conversations about the ideas that shape our world.
If you're at all intrigued by what we've discussed today, I highly recommend checking out Myth and Mayhem. It's a really thought-provoking read that'll make you question your assumptions and give you a deeper understanding of this complex and influential figure.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp, keep asking those tough questions, and keep exploring.